episode of Exploring the Renaissance in Assassin's Creed 2. This is episode 2, the most immaculate of conceptions. It's not who you think. But before I begin, I just want to start with not so much a trigger warning, but just a FYI that this is a very theological heavy episode. And while I do not mean ever to offend anyone, I am looking at the Catholic faith from an academic point of view and not a religious one. So just be cool. Thank you. So this artwork, it's absolutely stunning. And as you may notice, it is round. This is the Madonna and Child in Scenes from the Life of St. Anne. This was by Fra Fillipo Lippi in 1451, and it is tempera on wood. For those of you who have played Assassin's Creed 2, it is available to purchase in Florence. The first thing you're going to notice about this is obviously that it's round. It is a circle. This was a very popular art style in the Renaissance, and it was popular for the home. So unlike your other grand pieces that you added to your collection, this was more of a private piece that you hung for your family to enjoy, and it usually consisted of the Holy Family. But I will get into more detail about that in a bit. But first let's talk about the artist, because he's absolutely crazy, and one of the more exciting artists in this series. So, Fra Fillipo Lippi. Well, first, what does Fra mean? Fra means friar, so he was a monk. And to be clear, he was a monk in name only. He did not take his vows seriously. He joins the Carmelite monks at around 16 years old. They wear brown robes, a black hood, and a white cloak. But that's really all I know about them. But he joined them when he was 16 years old and didn't really stay there that long. So he went AWOL pretty quickly, and at one point was captured by pirates and held for ransom. He was hired by the Medici family of Florence to do a commission, and while most people would see that as an honor, he apparently didn't want to do it, and so they arrested him until he did. Finally, he apparently had a lot of debts, so he made forgeries, and none of this was enough to get him thrown out of the church, because they knew how good of a painter he was, and they didn't want to lose him. So they kind of looked the other way. So, around the 1450s, he was about 50 years old at this point, and he became chaplain of nunnery. So a chaplain is the priest of a private chapel. And while he was at this nunnery, he fell in love. He fell in love with Lucretia, a 20-year-old novice nun. And depending on what history you read, either they ran off together or he kidnapped her. It's unclear. But regardless, it did result in his son, Filippino Lippi. This was kind of the last straw for the Pope, and I think he kind of just gave up and said, okay, look, I think your true gifts to God are in art and not so much being a man of the cloth. So he allowed Lucretia and Filippo Lippi to leave the church in order to marry. They didn't, but they did have another child together, a daughter. So there's that. Oh, and if you want to know what Lucretia looks like, well, you already do, because she's the Madonna in this painting. Most of the Madonnas in his artworks were modeled by Lucretia. So he had a bit of an obsession. So for the last 10 years or so of his life, he had a studio in Florence, and many of his students went on to be quite famous themselves, including Sandro Botticelli, who will be featured in episode 14, 15, and 16, Pietro Perugino, who will be featured in episode 18, and Pietro Perugino also studied under the artist for episode 3, Andrea del Verrocchio. Here. A lot of interweaving stories in the Renaissance. Oh, finally, Filippo Lippi died in the 1460s from poison. And it's anyone's guess as to who poisoned him. So that was Fra Filippo Lippi. So just because you were a man of the cloth didn't mean you couldn't have fun, I guess. But regardless, He was a wonderful artist and extremely talented, as you can see in this artwork here. But now, let's return to, well, let's look at this. Let's take a serious look at this artwork for a moment. We have 3 scenes here. Okay, we have the Madonna and Child in front, modeled by Lucretia. We have a woman giving birth up in a fancy apartment, and some women coming to meet her. And then we have a couple on a weird staircase. Now, all of this comes down to the fact that this painting is about the Immaculate Conception. And if you're thinking, sure, okay, famous Christian birth, Christ, he was immaculately conceived, you'd be wrong. Because, yes, he was immaculately conceived, but that's not who this is about. Because as we all know, Christ was born in a stable, and this is a fancy Florentine apartment. This is in fact the birth of his mother Mary. She is the Immaculate Conception. Let me explain. Here we get into a bit of the heavy theology, so if you already know it or you're just not interested, feel free to skip ahead. But in order to explain how Mary became the Immaculate Conception, I need to go all the way back to Adam and Eve. So, Adam and Eve, they sinned, they were in the garden, and they sinned by eating the apple. And this sin, when they disobeyed God, was so severe, it kind of imprinted on every human born after. So ever since then, any human born is born with this original sin kind of attached to them, because they disobeyed God and ate the apple. But here's the good part. Because Christ, by dying on the cross, obeyed God, he fixed Adam's mistake. He died on the cross, and he allowed this original sin to be taken care of. He allowed people to have a baptism. Now, if you have a baptism, this sin is literally washed away. Now, to be clear, you can still have the other 7 sins throughout your life, but this one, you can kind of literally just get wiped clean from your record. Okay, now back to the Renaissance. So, this was a time of great, intellectual thought, debate. Education was really highly valued, but there's always a dark side to that, because sometimes people start asking questions that don't have answers. And for the church, this was a problem, because it was realized that Mary must have had original sin. She was born well before Christ sacrificed himself, obviously, so she must have had original sin. And if that were true, she couldn't be this perfect, pure vessel that God had chosen to give birth to Christ. This was a very hot topic in the Renaissance, and it upset and scared a lot of people. And they really needed a solution. And unfortunately, at first, the church didn't really have one. So they went, but the answer was found in the Apocryphal Bibles. So the Apocryphal Bibles, they are folk tales about biblical stories. They are not from the Bible. They're stories about biblical people, biblical times. And they kind of, just became accepted as true. Now today, many of them are accepted as canon, like this one here, but not all of them. So this story from the Apocryphal Bibles, from this medieval story and legend, is about Joachim and Anne. These are Mary's parents.
It's a few stories, normally about a guy with a crazy name whose wife has a normal name. In that town lives Zacharias and his wife Rachel, and you're like, how come she gets to be Rachel? On their way to Galilee, Jesus met Enos and Barak and their wives, Kylie and Lauren, and you're like, what?
Now, Joachim and Anne do not appear in the Bible. As I said, this is a medieval story that everybody loved and just took hold. So, Joachim and Anne famously met in Jerusalem under this great Jerusalem gate. They shook hands, and it was a momentous moment because this was when the parents of Mary first meet. And so then it was theorized that, well, maybe that's when Mary was conceived. Maybe in this first meeting, when either they shook hands or maybe they kissed on the cheek, that this was enough to cause Mary to be conceived in Anne. So there was no sinning involved, because yes, even if you're sinning to make a baby, it is still a sin. So that's fun. Regardless, because there was no sinning involved, that would make Mary exempt from this original sin. And therefore, she was indeed this pure vessel that could carry the Christ child. Now let's return to the painting itself, specifically the shape. As I said, this was a popular painting style in the Renaissance. And it is called a tondo, a round painting, and it is meant to invoke a bowl or a platter, even a shield, perhaps. And this is important because there was also a Florentine ceremony. So in Florence specifically, women had a pretty important ceremony amongst themselves. Now, when a woman was about to give birth, the local women would gather at her bedside and, offer moral support. And when the baby was born, this ceremony was held where she was fed her first meal. And this was a very important first meal. Sometimes I think it was usually a broth, because it was meant to heal her, sustain her, give her energy. Because as we know, just because the baby's born doesn't mean anyone's out of danger. And this was really the only option they had to try and keep mom and baby safe. And so this ceremony meant a lot. Now, this bowl that held this woman's first meal post-birth usually contained an image of Madonna and child. Not always, but it makes sense as to why they would want the Madonna there with them during this difficult time. If there's any sort of ceremony today after women give birth, I think you're just kind of handed, a Jell-O or ice chips or something. I don't know. But it's kind of a nice tradition. So it's a fun kind of meta connection that the artist is making here by saying this is a tondo, this is supposed to invoke this bowl from this ceremony where we bring a new person into the world. And it's also kind of paying tribute to the women of Florence and their contribution and, the danger that was in pregnancy. But then we have a third reason wrapped into this, because this painting shows the birth of Mary as well as what it led to, the birth of Christ. Filippo Lippi was just very intelligent and very clever. Not also just not in anything besides art. Let's look at the individual scenes. But first, let me say that there are 3 scenes, and that is important. The Renaissance loved symbolism, whereas medieval art was really the poor man's Bible, where it really made everything clear so you knew what you were looking at. That wasn't the case in the Renaissance. It was more an I spy game. And depending on how clever you were and how much you knew, that's how much you could recognize in the painting. So it kind of became a little bit of an academic challenge. Now this painting here is kind of toying with this older Gothic idea as well as this new Renaissance theme, because we are telling a pretty clear story of Joachim and Anne meeting, the birth of Mary, and what it all leads down to. But at the same time, we are also there are also a lot of smaller symbols throughout this painting that are more relevant to current styles that are specific to the Renaissance. But as I was saying, the number 3 is very important. 3 represents the Trinity, okay? The God, Christ, the Holy Spirit. So you'll see the number 3 occur in a lot of places in Renaissance art. So when you see something that's in threes, that's what that is referring to. Now, let's go look at this individual scene here. Let's look at Joachim and Anne here on this weird staircase. Because why? What is it? And this, again, this is specific to Filippo Lippi himself, because he was a Florentine man, and he was very, very proud of being from Florence. And Florence was famous in the Renaissance because they had just designed and built an architectural marvel, the Duomo, or as they knew it, the Florence Cathedral. Now, I won't go into too much detail, but all you need to know is that this building is still famous today because it is an architectural marvel. It took over 100 years to finish building this church, and for about 50 years, they didn't know how to complete it. They knew they wanted a big dome on top, but they didn't have the engineering skills to figure out how. So if you're thinking, wait, did the church just sat there for 50 years with a giant hole in it? Yes, it did. Until this artist and inventor, Brunelleschi, came along, and he figured out how to build the dome. So, because of this, Florentines were very proud of their engineering skills, their mathematical skills. They're very proud of the Duomo and Brunelleschi's contribution to the Renaissance. And so architecture play a big role in artists from Florence. Another Florentine artist in this series is in episode 8, and you will notice immediately that while it is not the main point of the painting, there is unbelievable amount of detail in the architecture and the buildings in this painting. Again, because they're very proud of their right angles and their engineering skills. All this comes down to the fact that this weird staircase, which has replaced Jerusalem City and the Jerusalem Gate, is a tribute to Brunelleschi and the Duomo. So instead we have this odd-looking staircase that goes nowhere, but do notice that there are 3 doorways. They might not go anywhere, but there are 3 doorways, and that is important. Beneath it, notice the corner of Carrera tile. So Carrera tile has been around in Italy since, the ancient Roman times, but the Renaissance also really capitalized on it. And in Florence especially, you'll see it covering the Duomo, and what makes this church look so gorgeous. So it was also very popular to have it as tile flooring in your home or in a chapel. And again, that's just another example of their mathematical skills, their engineering skills, because this was very hard marble, it was very sturdy, and it came in all these fabulous colors. So why not decorate with it? Okay, so we've handled the weird staircase. Let's return to Mary on the right here being born. So you'll know, as I said, this is a ceremony from Florence, from the Renaissance, and so that is who these well-wishers are, who are coming to see what's happening, who are coming to meet this new baby. But they play a double role by cutting across the painting. Not only are they directing the story by saying, okay, this is where, they are also literally pointing to where we are supposed to look. They are leading the eye up to baby Mary, because that is the focus of this painting. Because this painting is certifying that the Immaculate Conception was indeed Mary, and kind of putting this topic to rest. And the artist did this on purpose. He's leading the eye there with these women coming in. So that's why this kind of odd comic book formation of cells it's not really a real house, as I said with the staircase. It's very fantasy. There's no realistic things here. This is not a real house or a real street. But it's close enough that you understand what you're supposed to be looking at. The well-wishers themselves, you may or may not notice that their clothing looks a little odd. train. And this is because it's not real clothing. They didn't base it off of what anyone was currently wearing at the time. This is kind of pseudo-biblical clothing you'll see in a lot of Renaissance artwork. So Renaissance Italy became obsessed with ancient Rome, and they found all these ancient Roman sculptures. And so because Christ lived during the time of ancient Rome, it was okay. We should reference it and we should study it. And so ancient Roman togas and clothing really became pseudo-biblical clothing. So that's what you'll see Christ and his disciples wearing in a lot of scenes. But it's an interesting turn that he has these modern women in this modern ceremony in Florence running to meet Anne in this biblical clothing. He's really kind of playing with the contemporary and the biblical here. And this was another theme that kind of took hold in the Renaissance, another style, because to depict biblical scenes in contemporary, in modern situations. So as I said earlier, St. Anne has given birth to Mary in a very fancy Florentine apartment. In the front here, you'll see Mary's wearing very fashionable clothing. Okay, now this was actually so he's really playing with the idea that he's really playing with this theme of old and new, biblical and Renaissance, combining them. And for many, while this style did catch on, it was also quite scandalous because it was depicting, biblical people in clothing that just everyday people wore. This was just their normal street clothes. And that for some, that was seen as, impolite and not respectful. Today, perhaps, it would be Madonna and Child would be Mary in jeans and sunglasses. And baby Christ here, sitting on her lap, would have an iPad. It wasn't meant to be disrespectful. The point of it was to say that Christ is immortal. Christ is always around us. So if he were around today, why wouldn't he wear modern clothing? Why wouldn't he look just like us? And that's why this theme and this style of art really took hold in the Renaissance and continued on into the Baroque period as well. Now let's return to the center of this artwork, what it all comes down to, which is the Christ child, who was indeed born from Mary, who was a pure vessel, Madonna and Child. As I just mentioned, Mary herself is wearing contemporary Florentine clothing. She is dressed to the nines. She is very well off, but as Renaissance viewers would have noticed, her clothing is very fine and very well made, but it's not gaudy, it's not overdone. She's not covered herself in jewelry. It's all very tasteful because she was a humble woman at heart. And she wasn't bogged down by earthly possessions and things like that. She is, the mother of God after all. Now, when we look at Mary, what we might notice first is her amazing halo. And baby Christ, baby Mary in the background, as well as St. Anne, all have these unusual halos. And I absolutely adore them. Because if you think of last episode with St. Chrysonicus, their halos look nothing alike. There's absolutely nothing in common. And these were painted in the same decade. Okay, just a few cities apart. But while one was still stuck in the past of medieval Gothic style, this is absolutely new Renaissance style pushing boundaries here. And it is again Filippo Lippi referencing the new and exciting events and things happening in the Renaissance. Because if you looked at this and said, well, those halos look like glass, you would not be wrong. I think that's what he was indeed trying to signify. And that's important because Murano glass, which became famous in the Renaissance, which is Murano glass is from Venice, Italy. And they have always kind of been famous for their well-made glass work. whether it was, you know, goblets and vases, or today more so artistic pieces. While today I think the most famous, the most recognizable of Murano glass would be the blue color, which is absolutely stunning. In the Renaissance, they were more famous and they put themselves on the map because they invented crystal clear glass, cristallo. So until this point, glass was always colored. We invented glass in the Middle Ages, and we have stained glass in all these churches, and it's all these bright colors because that was the only option. We added more color to make it look pretty, and we could have different colors, but even the most plain, simple, cheap glass was going to be kind of a gray, cloudy color. And then Murano glass figured out how to make cristallo, completely clear glass. And this was the item to have. These were more valuable, honestly, than the paintings you were building for your collection. This was the item to have, whether it was a goblet, whether it was a vase. During grad school, I went and visited a mansion. I don't remember what house it was, but it was this beautiful old 18th century house, and everything in it was just so over the top and just covered with all these historical and beautiful items. But we walked into this one little study, and they took us in there, and it had this huge fireplace and these paintings on the wall and these beautiful upholstered chairs. And they were like, okay, can you guess which item in here is the most rare and the most expensive? And we all assumed, maybe it was this beautiful furniture, possibly the painting itself. No. It was the two glass candlesticks on either side of the fireplace. And for us, it didn't look like anything. They were just clear glass candelabras. But they were, in fact, original Murano cristallo glass. And they were one of the most valuable things in that entire historic house, which is crazy, because today we think nothing of having, crystal clear glass. It's everywhere. But it was such a revolutionary thing in Renaissance Italy. I'm getting off topic. Let's do another quick comparison. Let's build off of episode 1, when I talked about the difference between tempera paints and oil paints, and how the artist Michele Giambono was clearly painting in the style needed for tempera paints, and therefore didn't know what he was doing with oil paints. And now oil paints did offer the Renaissance far more capable, far more options, and they could be a lot more experimental. If you knew how to use tempera paints like Filippo Lippi here, you didn't need anything else. This man was clearly a master at what he did, and as a monk, it makes sense that he grew up painting in tempera, since he painted altarpieces, he painted frescoes throughout his life. So he was used to this medium, and honestly, by the time he died, oil paints were only just being introduced. So there was really no point in him learning this new medium when he'd already mastered this one. So let's talk about the chair that Mary is sitting on. This is a high-backed chair. Now, in the Middle Ages, there were no chairs with backs. The only chairs that had a high back like that were thrones, and that meant you were royal. Otherwise, you sat on benches, you sat on stools. But in the Renaissance, it became quite common for really every household to have a high-backed chair. And I think this is another lovely symbol of Mary. That's kind of twofold. One, it's referencing the fact that Mary is Queen of Heaven. This did at some point invoke a throne. But also it is saying, well, today, this is just a normal chair for the normal everyday man. And Mary is humble and would have been one of the people. So she is one of us sitting in a chair just like we would. However, I will say you can see a corner of the chair behind her shoulder, and there is evidence of upholstery. Now, upholstery was very popular in the Renaissance with these chairs because it was just another excuse to decorate your house. So you could put mythological themes here, biblical themes. More often, I think they used their coat of arms or their family motto, but it was just another surface in their house that they could decorate, and so they did. To go further with the chair, furniture wasn't considered art really until the Renaissance. You know, it was skilled, it was well made, it could have patterns and decorations, but it was really kind of considered more of an engineering. They were tools, they weren't pieces of art. But in the Renaissance, with all of this high trade occurring, these new woods and these new construction materials had shown up. And so artisans and woodworkers had access to something much to softer woods. Rather than working with traditional oak for furniture, they could use something softer like elm. And this is wood that was much easier to carve, much easier to bend, and work to your will. And so I think we see that in this lovely curved chair. Again, another reference to the wonderful trade that was happening in this time. And kind of the transference from, well, is it a tool? Well, why can't it also, furniture is just furniture. It's like, no, it could also be another piece of art in your home. Lastly, we have little baby Jesus himself. And to be fair, this is one of the more natural depictions of the baby Jesus I have seen. And if you've seen other Renaissance artworks, sometimes they struggled with baby Jesus. And I won't get into too much detail as to why, just know that it was a common issue, and sometimes baby Jesus ended up looking sillier than he was meant to. But this is quite an adorable depiction, and really looks like a baby. He's nice and chubby, and even his expression, while a little serious, looks, real. In his hand is a pomegranate. Now, a pomegranate had multiple meanings to it. Since ancient times, it has always been a sign of fertility. And so, again, we have another meta aspect of, the tondo, the bowl, the reference to this ceremony for women giving birth, the fertility of St. Anne, the fertility of Mary, of the importance of giving birth to the Christ child. So fertility is very important. However, the pomegranate also played another role. It was often seen as a symbol for the crucifixion. The pomegranate, like other red fruits, the juice was bright red, and this was seen as, like wine, a symbol of Christ's blood. And so red fruits often became a symbol of the crucifixion. And so here we have almost two meanings again. So baby Christ is either sweetly handing his mother a pomegranate seed to eat, showing, their bond and their closeness. Or perhaps he is referencing the truth that they both know, which is his destiny to die on the cross. And finally, look at this cute little cushion that's under his butt. It's just the cutest little thing. I can't get enough of it. And I'm curious if this was an addition to whatever model was actually sitting there with a baby, and they wanted to keep, things safe for in case any accidents occurred, or if this was just an artistic addition because, Christ deserved to have a little cushion for himself too. I don't know, I just think it's adorable. But wow, we made it all the way through. So this is, so thank you for joining me. This is the end of episode 2. the most immaculate of conceptions, it's not who you think. And as we all know now, it is Mary. Thank you for watching. And if you're interested, check out the rest of my series and follow me online. I am on Instagram and Twitter. Why am I'm not on Twitter. What the heck? Why did I say that? I am on Instagram and I'm also on Tumblr if you are interested. Bye.